Good evening and welcome to the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome. My name is Susanna de Beer and I'm Director of Ancient Studies and Classical Reception at this institute. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you today to today's KNIR research dialogue by Andrew Laird entitled The Education of Aztec Princes, Renaissance Learning and the Native Elite in Post-Conquest Mexico. Both a warm welcome to you here present in the room and of course to all of you with us online via Zoom. Before I will properly introduce the speaker, for those of you who are new to the KNIR, just a few words about our institute, our mission and the research and teaching program in which this dialogue takes place. The KNIR is the largest of the 5 Dutch scientific institutes abroad. We serve as an important bridge between the 6 Dutch university partners of the KNIR and the resources and extensive academic community present in Rome. In so doing, we aim to support research projects carried out by early career and senior scholars and offer a rich course program for students from these same universities. The Institute was established at the beginning of the 20th century to carry out research in the Vatican archives that had opened some 20 years earlier by Pope Leo XIII. The KNIR soon expanded its area of activity to other fields of research, in particularly the art history, ancient studies and archaeology of Italy and the Mediterranean. Since 1933, the Institute has had its own building here in the Valle Giulia, an area which was allocated for international institutions during the fascist regime. After the Second World War, the KNIR played an important role in the re-establishment of the scientific and cultural ties between the Netherlands and Italy. And since the early 1990s, the Institute has focused primarily on the academic world. Since then, the Institute has an ever more interdisciplinary focus, looking beyond our traditional fields of research, also beyond the borders of Rome, Italy, and in the Mediterranean, with a research focus that can be summarized as Rome in the world and the world in Rome. Apart from this broader research mission, we are also currently conducting a research project in collaboration with the University of Groningen called SECOPS, Settler Colonial Paradigms, Classical Receptions, Territoriality, Legality, and Indigeneity. By connecting experts from the humanities, social sciences, law, and geosciences, this research network aims to unveil the dominant paradigms shaping the historical development and reactivation of settler colonialism, with a particular focus on the formative or legitimizing role of classical models and classical scholarship in this process. It is in connection with this research project that our current series of research dialogues is dedicated to topics related to colonialism and the history of scholarship, art, and literature, such as the talk of this evening. Moreover, today's topic also fits perfectly in a course that is being taught at the moment at the KNIR by our colleagues Mariana Franzoso and Annemarieke Willemsen, entitled Collecting the World in Rome. Our speaker of tonight, Andrew Laird, held positions in the universities of Oxford, Newcastle and Warwick in the UK before moving to Brown University, Rhode Island, where he is the John Rowe Workman Distinguished Professor of Classics and Humanities and Director of the Center for the Study of the Early Modern World. His primary research interests are in classical literature, poetics, Latin humanism, and the history of scholarship in Europe and the Americas. His book publications include Powers of Expression, Expressions of Power, Ancient Literary Criticism, Italy and the Classical Tradition, and The Epic of America. His latest monograph, Aztec Latin, Renaissance Learning and Nahuatl Traditions in Early Colonial Mexico, was published with Oxford University Press earlier this year, 2024. Before giving him the floor, just a reminder to you that this is a dialogue, which means that after Andrew's talk of about 50 minutes, there's ample time for discussion and sharing thoughts on the topics with participants here in the room and online. But now really, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Susanna. And I'd also like to thank Matthias Jonker, who played a part in bringing me here today. And it's wonderful to be here. This is an interdisciplinary talk in front of an interdisciplinary group. I'm trying to make everything I'm saying introductory. In the discussion, we'll see whether I've succeeded, whether I've brought everyone with me. But questions of any kind, as well as points and interventions, will be welcome. It's always worth emphasizing that there was no such thing as classics before the 1800s. School children and students in earlier centuries did, of course, learn Latin and occasionally Greek, sometimes to a very high level, but there was no specific study of classics. It didn't exist as a subject. Instead, classical texts were subsumed into the program of grammar, rhetoric, and logic known as the trivium, which had been inherited from the Middle Ages. The study of rhetoric meant that knowledge of classical literature was seen as a means to an end, because ancient authors provided models for the good writing of Latin, and students closely read classical texts, scouring them for exemplar or illustrative comparisons from history and myth, for apt quotations, or for points of information which they could use in their own compositions. The role of rhetoric, the classical art of eloquence in 16th century education, could be likened to what we would now call essay writing technique. But skills in composition were accorded much more importance than they are today, so that Renaissance authors who wrote textbooks on the subject of composition devoted just as much attention to rhetorical theory as any of their predecessors in antiquity, like Cicero or Quintilian. In New Spain, as colonial Mexico was known, rhetoric was systematically taught in colleges and universities, along with grammar and logic, just as it was in early modern Europe. And just as in Europe, rhetoric was taught in Latin, using sources in Latin. The exclusion zone imposed by Latin meant that rhetoric was always the domain of the privileged, to which indigenous groups in Spain's colonies, like the masses in Europe, generally had no access. The social and ethnic stratifications operating in New Spain are reflected by the fact that the Royal University of Mexico admitted only Spanish students when it opened in 1554. But this talk will highlight an exception to that rule. 20 years before the Royal University of Mexico was established, some native Mexican youths were already undergoing a higher education in Latin and rhetoric at a college specifically founded for them, and that's the college in the picture. In the first part of this talk, I'll explain the circumstances which led to a select group of Indians, as the Spaniards called them, receiving such advanced instruction, and describe what and how they were taught without getting too technical. And then the second and third parts of this talk will look at the consequences of that education, showing how the native Mexican alumni applied what they'd learned, both in their scholarly work and to assert their own interests in a colonial society. And then, if there's time, I'll talk a bit about the art of speaking practiced by the Aztecs before the Spanish incursion, to show that this had very little in common with the kind of rhetoric the Europeans introduced. And finally, in closing, I'll consider the consequences that the missionaries' provision of a rhetorical training to the indigenous elite in Mexico 500 years ago might have for the way we approach both the history of scholarship and ethnohistory today. So, to begin with, the circumstances in which the native elite were educated. If you've got my handout, you can see there's a timeline, which I'll explain for those who haven't online. The Imperial College of Santa Cruz, which you can see in the picture, was originally established in 1536. It was adjacent to the convent and church of Santiago, and the church is there. And it was in a place called Tlatelolco, which after the conquest remained a native indigenous enclave 4 kilometers to the north of Mexico City. And it was on that very site where the Aztec commander Cuauhtémoc had made his last stand against the Spaniards only 15 years before. The capture of Cuauhtémoc signaled the fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521. And in the foreground here, you can see the excavated ruins of the great temple in pre-Hispanic Tlatelolco. The college was founded with the patronage of New Spain's first viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, and support from the Franciscan Bishop of Mexico, Juan de Zumárraga. And as you can see, the college was not too dissimilar in design from those being constructed in Europe at the same time. Anyone who's been to Oxford and Cambridge will be familiar with that setup of a chapel, dining hall, accommodation arranged around a cloister. Here, though, it's not Cotswold stone, but the grey volcanic rock purloined from the adjacent ruins of that great temple. The purpose of this institution was to prepare youths drawn from central Mexico's native elites for service as Christian governors and judges in their own communities. That method had already been tried and tested on Taino youths on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, and there was a boarding school for the sons of converted Muslims in the reconquered emirate of Granada, which was also called the College of Santa Cruz. The Spanish crown thus sought to consolidate control over newly subjugated populations by creating an appropriately schooled indigenous governing class. At the same time, the missionaries in Mexico had an objective of their own. They had realized that native Latinists could serve as interpreters and help them to produce translations of scripture, all kinds of Christian texts into the Mexican language of Nahua and other Mesoamerican languages. Training students to be leaders had been a tenet of higher education in Europe since the Middle Ages. And Quentin Skinner in the Foundations of Modern Political Thought has pointed out that most Renaissance Latin treatises on the subject of educating leaders were essentially rhetorical treatises. Francesco Patrizi's Kingship and Instruction of a King, 1471, and Erasmus of Rotterdam's Education of a Christian Prince, 1516, were rooted in that rhetorical tradition. And they had as much importance in New Spain as they did anywhere in Europe. It was an explicit aim of the Santa Cruz in Tlatelolco that each student would be trained to be the most Christian prince, Principe Christianissimo, who could beneficially govern an Indian community. Franciscan chroniclers who taught at the college convey that the students' education was immersive in nature, but they give no detailed accounts of how that teaching was done. This suggests that the pedagogical methods the friars were using were so familiar that they didn't need to be explained because they were using the educational techniques used in Europe. And Erasmus and Vives had devised methods of encouraging eloquence in Latin, which were compatible with that trivium of grammar, logic, rhetoric. And those methods of Erasmus were widely adopted in England and Spain, as well as in the Low Countries. It's worth saying that the system of the trivium isn't as useless as so many historians and classicists nowadays seem to think. Grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic were not so much subjects as ways of dealing with subjects. It was a sort of general theoretical framework. So grammar, the study of how Latin and how language in general was structured and how it worked, was obviously taught first before students proceeded to rhetoric, which was the art of elegant and persuasive speech or writing. And dialectic consisted of both logic, studying how to define terms and make accurate statements, and disputation, which was the business of constructing arguments and detecting fallacies in the arguments of others. Those of us who teach perhaps realize just how important those skills are. And it's from that experience, I think lots of people, if they thought about it, would like to bring the trivium back, but we can't. Now, this sort of formation in clear critical thinking and in written composition or speech making did succeed in enabling some of the indigenous students to become judicious and eloquent leaders. It also meant that some were equipped to help the friars and their evangelical mission by making precise and engaging translations of religious texts from Latin into the Mexican language of Nahua. And on the handout, there's a passage I'll read. Fray Juan de Torquemada, who taught at Santa Cruz, names the teachers of the trivium at Tlatelolco. They had weighty masters in Latinity after Fray Arnaldo de Basacio, such as Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, who was in the college for 40 years, Fray Andres de Olmos. And for rhetoric, logic, and philosophy, they had the very learned Fray Juan de Gauna, Fray Francisco de Bustamante, and Fray Juan Faucher. That testimony is important not just for the names, but another reason. It indicates that rhetoric and logic and philosophy were taught together, not separately, reflecting a progressive trend set by the Dutch rhetorician Rudolf Agricola. In his aptly entitled De Dialectica Rhetorica, which first appeared in 1506, Agricola proposed that rhetoric should be combined with dialectic, and that logic should not be studied as an end in itself, but was better employed in more practical contexts. And scholars in New Spain embraced this approach. The famous Augustinian philosopher Fray Alonso de la Vera Cruz, who taught at the Royal University of Mexico, praised Agricola and his followers for bringing back a golden age and a return to sanity. Another Franciscan scholar in Mexico even wrote a short poem about the Dutch rhetorician's skill. And in fact, the friars at the College of Santa Cruz were using state-of-the-art textbooks by Northern Europeans like Franz Dittelmans and Augustine Huneeus. And all those textbooks subordinated logic or dialectic to the art of rhetoric. Other books at the college included Quintilian's Education of an Orator, Vives's Dialogues, Erasmus's celebrated work on how to write letters, and a collection of Erasmus's own letters. And you had texts of classical Latin authors, Cicero, Caesar, Sallust, Livy, available as models for students to imitate in their own writing. And there was another copy of Quintilian's Education of an Orator in the convent of Santiago, adjacent to the college. And these annotations, the copy still survives, and the annotations give an idea of the thoroughness with which rhetoric and Quintilian's huge work was being studied in Tlatelolco. And there are several sources that affirm the capacities of the Mexican students. A friar reported in the 1540s that the collegians were astonishing their teachers with their Latin speeches and disquisitions. And even the professor of rhetoric at the University of Mexico, Cervantes de Salazar, a pupil of Vives, had favorable remarks about the College of Santa Cruz. He says, "A college has been founded for the Indians who are taught to speak and write in Latin. They have a teacher from their own people, Antonio Bellariano, in no way inferior to our own Latin instructors, learned in the observance of the Christian faith and very devoted to cultivating eloquence." And this is a picture of the native teacher in question, Antonio Valeriano, who later became a judge in 1573. And this is from the Codex Urbain, which is in the British Museum. And this image usefully shows how members of the acculturated indigenous elite were on the cusp of two worlds. Don Antonio is sitting on the straw throne of an Aztec lord or Tlatoani, wearing a turquoise chihuitzoli, which is the mitre-like hat. But in his hand, he's got a Spanish staff of office. And the glyph above the throne shows a three-pronged symbol for water with a bird's head on top of it. Water in Nahuatl is atl, and bird is totl. So the combined root form of those words, a and to, spells Anton, the name of Christian name of Valeriano. He was a nephew of Montezuma, not a remote nephew, a close one, and that's partly why he became the indigenous governor of Mexico City. But he was also the best-known native scholar, but we have the names and the writings of many others, including Antonio Cortés Totoquihuatzin and Pablo Nazareo de Xaltecán, whose Latin works survive. Although Mexican students' Latin oratory was praised by Franciscan chroniclers, there are no copies of any speeches, apart from one very short text which was delivered to a visiting dignitary at the college, which was recalled later in the 1580s. But what we do have is the letters the students wrote. And this is where rhetoric anyway was far more frequently displayed and much more usefully applied. In the Renaissance, rhetoric wasn't so much about public speaking, it was mainly about writing eloquently and persuasively. So nearly all the surviving Latin writings by the students from Tlatelolco, not all of them, but nearly all, are letters. And these texts not only provide clear evidence of how well the writers had mastered Renaissance rhetorical theory and practice in Latin, but they also, because they're petitions, open a window onto pre-Hispanic and colonial ethnohistory. And we can get some insight from the letters written by these students who were, of course, being trained as potential rulers. So they're naturally advocating for their communities. And in doing so, they tell us a lot about their particular polities and communities. The Valley of Mexico had been inhabited by several different peoples and language groups when the Spaniards first arrived in 1519. And in the dominant city-states, which are marked on the map, Nahuatl was generally the spoken language. Mexico Tenochtitlan and its sister city of Tlatelolco, their inhabitants together were known as the Mexica, who are now often called the Aztecs, and they'd become the most powerful of the Nahuatl-speaking polities. But each group called itself after the Altepetle or city-state to which it belonged, much as ancient Greeks thought of themselves not as Greeks, but as Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, and so on. The Mexica of Tenochtitlan forged and led a triple alliance in 1428 with the states of Texcoco and Tlacopan, a grouping which controlled the area covered by Mexico City today. So Textoko, Tlacopan and Tenochtitlan. And the idea that there was an Aztec empire is effective in one way, but what it really was a mutable symbolic confederation of city-states, which was led by the Mexica. And after the Spanish conquest, the tensions and rivalries between the different native principalities didn't go away. Some would retain their continued identity under Spanish control as republics, which were governed by Christianized descendants of their original pre-Hispanic rulers. And the students trained at the College of Santa Cruz were drawn from that select class and did, in many cases, become governors of their own polities. It's I think worth looking at some excerpts from some of the letters they wrote, because we can see how this education for princes was put into action. The letters they wrote to the Spanish crown ended up in the archive of the Indies in Seville. And the earliest known petitionary letter was written to Emperor Carlos, or Charles V, in 1552. By Don Antonio Cortes Totoquihuatzin, the indigenous governor of Tlacopan, and he's the figure on the left, supposedly. This, though, is a 17th century or possibly later illustration. Totoquihuatzin's letter closely conforms to the traditional guidelines given for dispositio, or layout, in those Renaissance textbooks on letter writing. And his rhetorical training is just as evident from the way he expresses himself in Latin. Listen to this excerpt from his opening greeting to the Emperor Charles. He says, "So lofty is your eminence and Caesarean majesty, most invincible Caesar, that among peoples everywhere the Christian quality of your soul, as well as your empire stretching far and wide, sounds on the lips of all and is proclaimed to the ends of the earth." He's using of the Holy Roman Emperor the conventional imperial title of Caesar, but Totoquihuatzin is playing on its Roman association. He later explains that, he says, in ancient times, the Indies of New Spain were divided into three parts, Mexico, Tlacopan, and Texcoco, echoing the way Julius Caesar had said that Gaul was divided into three parts. This is the writer's neat way of alluding to the once powerful Aztec Triple Alliance, of which his own polity of Tlacopan had once been a part. In his greeting to the emperor, Totoquihuatzin quotes the prophet Job's dictum that the life of man upon earth is warfare. He quotes it to praise the emperor for using his power as a world leader to serve and promote Christianity by, I quote, "fighting against barbarous peoples, pagans, and worshippers of devils, in short, against God's enemies, and then leading them from the darkness to the clear light possessed of Christians, and to pacifying them once conquered," we've heard that before, "enlightening them, and at last winning them for Christ." So the ancient Roman principle of pacification through conquest is invoked to win the Emperor Charles's goodwill, but the impeccably courteous tone that Totoquihuatzin is using becomes more double-edged as he goes on. He says, "You have brought the utmost peace and calm to this province of ours, which still has the humblest recognition of your immortal kindness, even though it may grieve at the slaughter of our elders and at the very great loss of our worldly wealth." The irony here is obvious, and at least one of Cortes Totoquihuatzin's brothers was killed by the conquistador Cortes, from whom he took his own Spanish name. The purpose of Totokiwatsin's petition was to seek relief from the labor and tribute imposed on Tlacopan by another conquistador, Juan Cano, and his Mexica wife, Isabel, daughter of Montezuma. Totokiwatsin is forthright about the aggravation she's caused the native governors of Tlacopan. He says, even though she was of our own blood and from our own country, she was herself so remote from humanity that instead of the duty and natural love which men of the same race and country usually show to each other, she exercised tyranny and has kept us in the position of slaves when we were born from renowned and noble parents. This sentence functions rhetorically to make clear that Montezuma's daughter had been of the same ethnic and national origins as the inhabitants of Tlacopan, yet at the same time, the writer identifies himself and others from the town as belonging to a distinct group, as is clear from his previous sentence. No other people is so fiercely oppressed by such a multitude of tributes as our people of Tlacopan, nostrum populum Tlacopanensem. And he's reiterating a complaint made earlier. All we Indians are worn down by tribute and much servitude, but especially we Tlacopaneca, maxime nos Tlacopanenses. Towards the end of his letter, Totokiwatsin sought to stress the importance his polity had before the Spanish incursion, and more questionably, the support its people had given the Spaniards against the Mexica. It's clear that while he was seeking an end to the abuses of Juan Cano, the writer was also using his letter to assert the distinctive prestige and patrimony of his own polity of Tlacopan. Nearly 10 years later, in February 1561, the principals of another Nahua-speaking Altepetl, or polity, Azcapotzalco, wrote to Philip II of Spain to secure a number of privileges for their town. This letter is eloquently written and follows many of Erasmus's recommendations about how such a letter should be composed. The writers use classical commonplaces as they playfully, or maybe not so playfully, describe themselves as poorer than Irus, the beggar in Homer's Odyssey, and more worthless than seaweed, viliores alga, an expression found in Virgil and Horace. And the handout has the rulers of Azcapotzalco using a motto that comes from a verse in Virgil's Aeneid, as they deliberate about whether Indians should dare to address a king. Fortune helps those who dare and drives back the fearful. Daring to do this, they affirm, is very well supported by what's shown in literature. Not only Christian princes, but pagan ones have been willing to hear their subjects please. And then to further incline Philip II to hear their request, they recall the famous story about the Roman Emperor Hadrian. On a journey which he was making, Hadrian was asked by a certain woman to hear her. When he replied he didn't have time, he heard that very woman say, in that case, don't be an emperor. At that, he was moved to hear her very readily. That famous episode now comes from the Greek historian Cassius Dio, whose biographies of the emperors were in fact printed with Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars in the 1500s, and it was Erasmus who published this. And that must be the source of the anecdote that the rulers of Azcapotzalco are using. And it has a good effect because while you could use that anecdote about Hadrian to any monarch who has to respond to a petitioner, Hadrian was one of the Roman emperors who was born in Spain and therefore an appropriate model for Philip II. But this letter isn't just nicely written. It's a unique source for the history of Azcapotzalco, which is on the left here. Azcapotzalco fell to the Mexica or Aztecs nearly a century before the arrival of the Spaniards. And in the fifth and largest section of this letter, we're told that it was founded 1,526 years before, in 35 AD. The writers hold that their former ruler, Tezozomoc, had died no more than 133 years before they were writing, and they underline the greatness of Azcapotzalco as a provincia in his reign. Azcapotzalco was capital of the Tepanec Empire. It had satellite kingdoms, which were ruled by Tezozomoc's sons or sons-in-law. It had tributaries and it had alliances with other principalities. And exactly the same pattern of domination and control would be adopted by the Aztecs themselves when their own triple alliance overwhelmed the Tepanec dynasty in 1430. And the Aztecs superimposed themselves on exactly the same territories. We're told all this in the letter. So the celebrated Aztec Empire, according to the writers, was really an appropriation and imitation of Tezozomoc's earlier dynasty. I'll now turn to the way that this education the students had also expressed itself when they were writing in their own language, in Nahuatl. It was, it's not popular to bear this in mind, but we have to face it, that it's inevitable that Nahua translations of Gospels, epistles, and works of European literature are bound to retain many features of the linguistic or stylistic features of the source texts. Methods of argumentation, allegory, metaphor are universal and can be transmitted in the Mexican language, and so can the use of exemplar or illustrations from classical literature. But people might ask, is this really authentic? Although authentic, I think, is sometimes a dangerous word to use. But look at this. This is the first example of an original, or probably the first example we know, of a literary fancy composition in the Nahua language. It's a manuscript that probably dates from 1540. And you can see the names of Greek sages like Plato, Pythagoras, Archytas are rubricated, along with the church fathers a couple of lines below. This is a dialogue between a teacher and a student. The COL abbreviation is for collegius or collegian, and the PA is short for pater. And these are the great names that they're conversing about. But what you might wonder is, why were those names rubricated? This has an element of display for European readers, and this manuscript ended up in Spain, perhaps to show that the Mexican language could be a vehicle for sophisticated humanist thought. Ideologically, that was important. The original work of written literature in Nahua I'm going to focus on now, though, has long fascinated historians of Aztec religion. And this was written under the direction of Franciscans in Tlatelolco with a long title, The Colloquies and Christian Teaching in which the 12 Friars of St. Francis converted the Indians of New Spain. And a section of it presents what the Aztec leaders had to say in response to the Franciscan missionaries who came to them in 1524. And the speech of the representative of the Mexican priests of the idols is compelling. After a courteous introduction, he makes his position clear. I quote, "You have told us that we do not know him, the one through whom we have existence and life, and who is Lord of heaven and earth. Likewise, you say those whom we worship are not gods. This way of speaking is very new and very shocking to us. We are horrified at such speech because our forefathers, who engendered and ruled us, did not tell us such a thing. The speaker then explains how ceremonies and sacrifice were ordained long ago, how the gods brought his people into being and provided the foods they eat and the rain that makes them grow. The gods live amidst flowers and greenery in Tlalocan, a place unknown to mortals, and their worship was instituted before recorded time in a number of legendary sacred places. The speaker says that to destroy those traditions would unsettle his people and incur the wrath of the gods themselves. Colourful and powerful though these words are, the retort of the Aztec priests to the missionaries was constructed to be a straw man. There are recognizable features of European rhetoric in this monologue. Its structure conforms precisely to the standard dispositio or layout for an oration in classical theory, and its content is really European as well. It's worth explaining how this works. After the exordium or formal opening, the Aztec speaker says he will use 2 or 3 arguments to counter what the friars have said. That is in clear defiance of the friars' assertion in the colloquios that no one will ever be able to contradict scripture. The narratio, which is labeled B in the manuscript, recapitulates what the Franciscans claimed, that the Aztec divinities are not gods, and challenges it, invoking the authority of their ancestors and the beliefs ordained. And a confirmatio sets out the attributes of the Mexica gods, listing the semi-mythical locations where their worship was initiated. And the effect of that is to counter the Franciscans' prior emphasis on the importance of Rome, a place which they had said the Aztecs could never see or know. The priest of the idol's closing refutatio in sections E to F consists of a series of admonitions. It would be unwise to change laws of ancient standing. The gods might be provoked and the people rise up if their beliefs are rejected. It's advisable to proceed slowly and calmly. These are appeals to act in ways that are practical, safe, and prudent. The topoi in rhetoric of utile, tutum, and prudens. And the formal conclusion is then the Aztec speaker says, we are all of one accord. It is enough to have lost. It is enough that they have taken power and royal jurisdiction from us. Where our gods are concerned, we would die before leaving their service and worship. That ending is full of pathos, but the tidy distinction the Mexican speaker makes between secular power and divine authority is very European. The speech was a Franciscan invention. Yet this oration has long been revered as a rare expression of Aztec belief in the face of Christianity, and it was central to Miguel León Portilla's influential La Filosofía Nahuatl, or Aztec thought and culture. Scholars from the US and Mexico continue to regard this as a unique testimony in which defeated sages were given the chance to have their say, despite the fact that the content is entirely shaped by the friars' earlier argument. One can see how the speech has been structured completely in conformity with ideas of a refutation from Cicero and Quintilian. But I think the imposition of structures from Latin rhetoric would have had a profound effect, or must have had a profound effect, on our expressions. We must imagine that native speakers hearing that missionary appropriation of their language would have sensed the imposition of an alien system of organization, and it must have sounded very weird. It's always been more obvious that the European presence in Mexico caused particular Nahua words to change their meaning. Ishkatl, cotton, for instance, came to designate sheep, wool, and even the Lamb of God, while neskalalisli, the word for resuscitation or coming round, came to be used of Christ's resurrection. But European rhetorical norms were also transforming the discourse of the Nahua language on a macro level, not just its vocabulary. And that was far more insidious. Now, if there's time, I have about 2 or 3 minutes, 4 minutes before my conclusion to talk about Aztec speech and how that fits in. And the people have tried to connect the later mastery of European rhetoric by indigenous students to the forms of ritual speech that the Aztecs have, which we know a fair bit about because speeches were transcribed by Sahagún and other friars in the 1500s. But I think this is where fools rush in, where angels fear to tread, and I think of myself as an angel. There is no doubt that Aztec rulers and principals, merchants, and interestingly, parents and midwives set great store by ritualized speech. The false recognition of this as rhetoric in the strong classical sense, can be traced back to the Franciscan missionary linguist Bernardino de Sahagún. In the 1570s, with the help of native Latinists he trained, he compiled his collection of Nahua speeches, translated them into Spanish for Book 6 of the Florentine Codex, which he entitled Libro de la Retórica, Filosofía Moral y Teología de la Gente Mexicana. Ethnohistorians still call those speeches rhetorical orations and liken them to classical or Renaissance epidactic oratory. But the greatest 20th century authority on Nahua, Ángel María Garibay, who was a scholar of ancient Greek, long ago warned against such misleading comparisons. In pre-Hispanic Mexico, there was nothing to correspond to the systematized art of rhetoric as it would have been recognized in 16th century Europe. In my view, to regard these Nahua speeches as examples of rhetoric, even in a looser, less technical sense, obscures the very qualities that make these discourses so distinctive and fascinating. The speeches Sahagún recorded consist of prayers to the gods, pronouncement for the institution of a new emperor, or set words of advice to youths or children, including exhortations to a new mother and the naming of a newborn child. So their counterparts in early modern Europe would be the legal, religious, or magical formulae, which constituted hymns, prayers, addresses for coronations and investitures, initiations, baptisms, and rituals related to birth, like the churching of women. Such events were, and in some cases still are, context for utterances which are redeployed again and again. On this basis, the Nahua speeches are more akin to orders of service that were required on certain occasions. The Aztec speaker was the performer of an oral text and had no need for inventio, finding material, which is fundamental to classical rhetoric. So arrangement, dispositio, and layout are irrelevant because this is oral discourse and it's structured associatively with rhythmic and repetitive formulations that are characteristic of oral literature. An example I put on the handout shows how the speeches abound in figurative language and metaphor. And scholars like John Miles Foley, Gregory Nage have accounted for the density of metaphor in oral texts, but there was no elocutio, no principle of conscious selection for figures or metaphors. And crucially, the Aztecs had no meta-language for the art of speaking. One word in Nahua, tlatoli, served for speech, language, word, or sentence. And discourse could be characterized simply as good or bad, whether in terms of form or content. It was memory, not rhetorical method, which provided the mechanism for generating new speeches to meet needs as they arose. So in a society without alphabetical writing, you have memorized sequence of phrasing prompted by pictorial codices, which provide the building blocks for the construction of new discourses. And Franciscan chroniclers give several accounts of how Indian converts who acted as interpreters could hear a lengthy sermon in Spanish and then perfectly relay the contents in their own language, occasionally making appropriate additions. I think the native Mexican scholars, with their thorough grounding in the trivium, would have been well aware, far more aware than the friars who taught them, of the categorical difference between the Christian texts they composed in Nahua on European rhetorical principles and the orally transmitted ritual speeches they may have heard from their grandparents. But you can see on the handout how, and I'm going to read this, how the native scholars in Nahua described the content of their Libro de Retórica. Here begins a book in which are told the various words of prayer, tlatla tlautilis tlatoli, with which they prayed to those who were their gods, how they made noble speech, tek pilatuaya, through which they displayed rhetoric, retórica, Spanish loanword, and moral philosophy, filosofía moral, Spanish loanword, as is evident in the discourses. So they're signaling the relevance of those Spanish categories in the context of Nahua speech, but they don't actually have the words for them. Aristotle pointed out that rhetoric can be displayed without conscious acquisition of it as an art, but the title, Rhetoric, Moral Philosophy and Theology, is tendentious. It conveys that this book of Nahua speeches is about those arts, when really it was an idolatrous liturgy with a connection to kingship. But the friars' original packaging of those speeches has had a long reach that comes up to 2024. So my conclusions. I've tried to bring together two areas of inquiry which are generally considered to be on different tracks: the study of early modern rhetoric and the field of ethnohistory. And bringing them together has challenging implications for each of those fields. The study of early modern rhetoric nearly always comes down to study of history of the Western book. Peter Mack's History of Renaissance Rhetoric is one of many examples. These exercises in the history of scholarship are concerned with the productions of selective and privileged groups, and they don't or seldom take cognizance of the broader socio-historical landscape. But early modern rhetoric was never really confined to Latin or the classroom, and colonial Mexico shows this as well as anywhere in Europe. School rhetoric pervaded speech and writing in all kinds of domains, from law, politics and religion, to literature and history writing, journals and diaries, and it traversed linguistic and cultural boundaries. The second general area, ethnohistory, the study of indigenous peoples, on the face of it, seems more reassuring and inclusive. Unlike scholars of Renaissance rhetoric, ethnohistorians are concerned with less privileged groups, and they can't generally rely on printed books as sources. Ethnohistorical sources range from maps, pictorial documents, material artifacts, to the recording of oral testimonies and the observation of continuing traditional practices in the field. Ethnohistorians also need to have knowledge of languages which, for European language speakers, present a much greater challenge than Latin. But the evidence presented in this talk might threaten some of those general conceptions of ethnohistory as well. We saw how the first literary composition in the Mexican language name checks ancient Greek philosophers. and how another early Nahuatl text, which was long thought to be an authentic defense of the Aztec religion, exhibits all the hallmarks of European classical oratory. Conversely, the petitions which indigenous authors wrote in Latin really do contain material of genuine ethno-historical interest. The examples of Nahuatl and Latin texts I've presented, and there are many more, could be used to make a case for dissolving the difference between ethnohistory and history in general. Ethnohistory originated in and is most commonly practiced in the Americas, particularly Mexico and the United States. It's a field that's emerged in the wake of colonialism and ongoing occupation. It may be partly for that reason that professional scholars are liable to exoticize indigenous peoples whose countries they themselves live in. These scholars sometimes fail to recognize how much the histories and forms of knowledge of the peoples they are studying are bound up with their own. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. I think it's absolutely clear how this Renaissance learning in this Latin grammar is much more than language learning, but really involves sort of the systematics of European rhetorical education. As I said in the beginning, there's ample time for questions, remarks, suggestions from the room, but also from the people with us via Zoom. And you can put up your hand digitally, or you can also start talking to us. Welcome. And then we will include you in our discussion here. Who can I give the floor for a question? Yeah.
Well, thank you for your very interesting lecture. I can't help but wonder about the practical way this college would work as it's educating Aztec nobility, so high-class youth, in a European-style college setting. So do we know anything about, were they boarding there? How did they have to change their clothes? Did they have an opinion about that? So can you tell us something about the practical way this college operated?
Yeah, I mean, my account is a more revisionist one. I think what has happened is that historians, particularly in Mexico for nationalistic reasons, are reluctant to recognize the complete immersion in Western Christian Catholic values and programming that these children who were probably began their education in the college at the age of 12 or 13. It was a sort of that they were taken away from their parents at a young age. So the idea that they had some kind of telepathic contact or deeper understanding of the pre-Hispanic world is wishful thinking. It's rather like their value as potential leaders was because they spoke the Nahuatl language. But the kind of education they had was identical to that boys, and the syllabus was the same as that of St. Paul's School, which Erasmus founded in London. So they were between two worlds. Because of their nobility, they were in contact with their families. They did return to their communities. But I think that it's wishful thinking that they necessarily thought like dissidents, maybe in protecting their own communities, as I said, in negotiating, vying with other communities for the privileges from the Spanish crown. But I think what you see from reading their material is that they actually identify with pagan Romans rather than barbarians. The rhetoric of the way in which they describe their ancestors is a pagan respectable empire, but without the benefit of Christianity. So I think the crucial thing is we mustn't leave the Catholic faith out of this subject. That was, of course, fundamental to the Franciscans who were tasked with educating them. It wasn't a religious school, but it was devout Franciscans who did the teaching. Does that help? Does that answer?
I hoped for even more practical, like how many were there, where did they sleep,
Right.
how much room did they have, what do we know about it?
Yeah.
Because I do know that we have some images of Aztec children being brought to school by their parents for younger education, so sort of primary education, because it was a kind of subject that appealed to European eyes. Mm-hmm. So it's something they could recognize, how these kids in weird clothes were taken to school by their parents. So I wondered about the pictorial sources, excavations, maybe things that have been left from those times, which would maybe show you a bit about how it would be to be at the college at the time.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest source is a manuscript which is known as the Codex Franciscanus, and this was all transcribed by Garcia Calsbelceta in the 19th century. I think the original manuscript has now disappeared, but Garcia Calsbelceta was a thorough and meticulous and careful editor. So what we have in this, I think it's 2 volumes, in fact. And there's so much material there. I mean, not all of it is interesting because it's things like bills for the candles and inventories of physical objects in the college, but names, numbers of students. Maybe this is the kind of thing you like. And I can... yeah, I can send you the reference, but the Codex Franciscanus is the crucial thing. Yes, and Torquemada, I mean, more accessibly in the Monarchia Indiana, has 2 or 3 chapters explaining how the boys lived, the dormitories, the ethos, and 1 or 2 anecdotes as well.
I see 2 questions there. No.
Thank you for the talk. My question kind of regards the petitions that you included and whether or not the use of this rhetoric and the use of what they learned at these schools actually ended up in a result from the Spanish Empire, and whether or not it was more effective because they were using the rhetoric.
That's interesting. It's an important question. We do have results from, I think, both those letters, because the figures who wrote them were conspicuous, and we've got other biographical data on what happened in the cases of the communities. The same Franciscan chronicler, Torquemada, describes how Antonio Valeriano, who was really the ruler of Azcapotzalco, who wrote that letter. It was signed by all the ruling families of Azcapotzalco, but Antonio Valeriano's signature is there. And there are a couple of stylistic signals that he's the author because of things he does in the letter, which he does elsewhere. And he not only secured what he wanted to, or what they wanted to, in that letter for Azcapotzalco. One of the things they asked for was a coat of arms, and they got it. That's evidence that it worked. But Torquemada tells us that Philip II actually replied to the letter. There was one prolific Latin letter writer, Pablo Nazareo, whose letters are actually more available because they've been printed several times in Mexico. He never got anything. But his Latin isn't as good as the other two. But I don't think that's the reason. I think it's because he was the governor Xaltacan, which is a very peripheral region. And although he makes a song and dance about how connected it was with the Aztecs before the conquest, and he also says how much of the Bible he's personally translated into Nahua, the three of these petitions didn't meet with any response at all. You can get much bigger figures with the Spanish ones and some letters written in Nahua, and Mexican historians like Maria Castañeda de la Paz have done a lot of work on tracking these stories and the narrative through archives. So there's a lot of material on this.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
I was wondering, especially when we have the glyphs in front of us, Nahua is a very pictorial, but when you write it down, it's pictorial. Do we see something of that in the rhetorics, that they use a different way of rhetoric, different way of fancy speak because of their writing it down in glyph, or not writing anymore in the 16th century maybe, but before that?
Well, I think are you asking whether the Latin has a different quality?
Yeah.
I think there are some obvious things. One is that a lot of surviving Nahua texts use the first person plural instinctively. And this could just be a linguistic practice, or some people, I've been looking at a book recently that argues that the pre-Hispanic Nahuas always thought of themselves as a collectivity. Maybe we can infer that, maybe we can't. But what is interesting is that when in the Renaissance, it's no longer acceptable to use the plural we in a letter. In the Middle Ages, you might have done that. Even in classical Latin, you do it. But Erasmus, who was the authority on how to write a letter and the one that they all used, said, don't use the we form, but they do. And this is because I think it's so common in what Nahua writing we have for a community to express itself in the first person plural. That's one of them. Sometimes you get what look like proverbs or maxims that don't have a classical or biblical precedent and look sort of odd. Something about I thought I could find one in the Bible of a resolve that's not shaken by wind, and it wasn't there, and that too looks and feels more Mesoamerican. But I'd always try to find the European answer first, because there is a danger of orientalizing. And as I replied to this questioner, we really have to understand that these children had been completely reprogrammed. They had a very different experience from children in European schools, but their education and much of their worldview was very similar.
Thank you.
So, two questions here. Okay, thank you.
And thank you very much. I'm quite interested about the missionary, their workings. You know that the missionaries, when they go to the part of Asia, go to China or Macau, Hong Kong, they are more the Jesuit. Instead, here are more Franciscans. So, firstly, I'm interested about the college, the building they are using, because we know in Rome or in the area of mostly in Italy, the Franciscans, their church are usually close to the city gates, and so they are more close to the poor people. They are working in this way. And well, when the missionary go to China, they are more Jesuit, so they are more close to the elites. So they are more about the techniques of painting or the design or architecture or the other things. So I'm wondering about how the Franciscans, they being in Mexico and to find their way to communicate with the poor people, or they are more with the elites, or how they find this kind of the different, how to say, the classes or different categories in the society. And more when I find in the handouts talking about a lot of the fairness, or then the power when they afterwards they have take this course of language. So did this give them, the poor people or the children from the poor family or the normal peoples, anything more or some power, or what we?
It's an interesting and important question. I think the story in Mexico would have been very different if the Jesuits had arrived earlier. The Jesuits didn't reach Mexico until 1572. So there was some 40 years or more of Franciscan, Augustinian, and Dominican activity. I think the exercise in the College of Tlatelolco wasn't particularly typical of the Franciscan enterprise. They clearly mixed at all levels of society, and were in fact admired, or they tell us they were, for their humility and their complete austerity, because some of these Franciscans were very fanatical indeed, and so lived on less and suffered more poverty than the people they were ministering to. An important thing about Tlatelolco is that a lot of the initial energy in dealing with elites was friars who were not Spanish but Flemish. And just as the Northern European textbooks were being used for the teaching, one of the things that set Tlatelolco apart was the fact that Spanish officials were complaining that the Indian students they were being Christianized, but they weren't being Hispanized. And that's because a lot of the people who taught them were not Spaniards. So this was an unusual, exceptional. I don't want to give the impression that the history of elite education anywhere is ever going to be a typical history. That this, we're talking about perhaps a cohort of 80 students at a time, no more than that, in an area with a very big population.
Yes, thank you for your very, very interesting lecture. While you were talking, especially when you were talking about the letters by native Mexican writers or authors, I was reminded of a very, well, not very, but a loosely similar case in Brazil for the 16th century. Very recently, we've translated some of the letters by Potiguar indigenous leaders who had first traveled from Brazil with the Dutch to the Dutch Republic. That's 1624, so it's a much later moment and a much different context, but they also learned Dutch. We have no information about where and how, but they did learn Dutch and they were converted to the Protestant faith. And then we see first that these indigenous leaders are writing letters in Tupi, so in their language, to possible allies in Brazil, so other indigenous groups who would ally with them and the Dutch. And then after 1654, when the Dutch leave and they are left, well, to their own lack of devices in Brazil, they start writing to the stadtholder and to the Heer 19, so the Lord 19th in the Netherlands, using a very, I would say, Protestant type of rhetoric about how they now deserve to be paid. And there's this whole discourse about money and payment and gold, praising it just like the Lord taught us. So it's an absolutely Protestant letter written by a Potiguar a man in the mid-17th century. And so I kept rereading these passages in your handout, and I think there's really a parallel to be traced, to be made in tracing how these indigenous leaders are. As you say, it's not ethnohistory, it's history, and it's not showing how indigenous worlds pre-conquest already had that kind of thinking. No, it's, or at least I dare say, it's showing how indigenous leaders were very apt at learning and reusing and strategizing in the terms of the conquistadores. So I think this is a brilliant example of something that was happening throughout the Americas, and that only now we're starting to see as more systematic resistance or survival strategy. So I guess I did the proverbial more of a comment than a question. Apologies for that.
No, but I'm very glad you made that. That's a wonderful comment to make, because I don't think I brought this out. Simon Ditchfield has done a wonderful article called Rome Calling. And what he's interested in is just with the church history, is that we mustn't see it as unidirectional. And I think a very important picture that emerges from what you've been doing and what I've been doing is the bidirectionality of this. I mean, when I started working in this area, I think I wanted to show to Europeans how their realm of Renaissance humanism, history of education, isn't confined to Europe. If you're interested in European history of education, you ought to be interested in the Americas as well, because this has been left out for a long. So history of linguistics, for example, until very, very recently hasn't included missionary linguistics, which brings theories about language which people had, which were not compatible with what influential grammarians who were told were the authorities. There were people actually going into print saying quite different things. And I think the bidirectionality is important also for Americanists, who I found are just as bad as ignoring Europe as Europeans are at looking at the Americas.
Thank you. I was just also maybe checking if people at home, if they're still with us online, may have questions. We have this nice slide up now. No questions there. I do have a question myself. I was wondering about these students, and I think you emphasized their being between two worlds, what that meant to their power and their status once they finished their studies. To what extent were they, well, they must have been important as the essential bridge between the two languages. What did they do to their power, their social status? Maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah, their power in their own communities, the education would have been irrelevant to that. But one of the things that struck me so much was, I felt I had to put it as a little appendix in my book, was a family tree of who these Latinists were and how close. Well, it's not just that they were close to the royal houses of Tenochtitlan, Tlacopan, Texcoco, Azcap. They were the royal houses. So all of these writers have, you can look at a family tree and they're only one or two names away from Montezuma. And that ancestry and status was what meant they would rule without question in their own communities. So I think that was something they clearly knew how to handle, how to be heard in their own communities. I mean, there's nothing to suggest that their authority was ever questioned because they'd been educated in their teens by the friars.
And then the other way around, let's say from the side of the Spanish, to what extent were they valued as these translators, or?
Well, they were always valued by friars, and up to the early 1600s, when the energetic culture of translation stopped. But the Spanish, after a while, didn't need indigenous administrators, and that's when imperial funding for the college stopped, because the Spaniards were families had married into the communities, they could appoint their own governors. And the thing that eventually led to Mexican independence and the independence of so many American countries was that the Spaniards would never hire American-born Spaniards to official roles. And you can imagine what resentment that would create among a Creole class. And the fact that there were enough Spaniards to to provide the manpower needed to run the viceroyalty meant that this stopped. And it's important to emphasize the college wasn't a Franciscan initiative. It was called the Imperial College because Charles V had funded it.
Okay, thank you very much. One last question here.
Just, yeah, sorry. There's two things I wondered about when I was quickly checking up on this college that I didn't know before, although I've been to the place. One is that wasn't it originally trying to educate Aztec people to be able to become priests?
This is a long-standing myth that everyone has bought into, but I think there's one person responsible for it. It's the French historian Robert Ricard, who wrote The Spiritual Conquest of Mexico. He perhaps assumes that a college like that would be a seminary because Franciscans were doing the teaching. It looks like a seminary. People are using Latin. This is the problem of 20th century historians, and especially historians of the Americas, being cut off from what European advanced education was like. Oxford and Cambridge colleges taught the trivium in Latin. You often had clergymen doing the teaching, but Oxford and Cambridge colleges were not seminaries. Tlatelolco was just like that in that respect. But it's a big fallacy. And I think because after the Mexican Revolution, the country, the intelligentsia became so secularized, they see Latin, they see friars, they think, oh, it must be a seminary, because the only Latinists you find in Mexico now are seminarians.
Okay. And a second thing is Martin de la Cruz.
Mm-hmm.
He was there, right?
He was an indigenous physician, yes.
So they also taught or actually studied indigenous medicine or botany?
It would have been not a formal part of the curriculum, but there certainly was a culture of medical studies there. And Martin de la Cruz had a license given to him by the viceroy, interestingly, to practice indigenous medicine. But even medicine gets structured by the trivium. Isidore of Seville explains how the principles of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic apply to recognizing symptoms, identifying them, and then healing them. And the example of the famous Latin libellus de medicinalibus indorum herbis, which is credited to Martin de la Cruz, it's, as you know, it's an indigenous herbal, but the structure of it is completely Galenic. So what was happening is that herbal remedies were being cookie cut into a European medical schema.
Thank you very much. I think there are more questions, but I think we will have to reserve them for after officially finishing. There will be ample time to continue the discussion. I wanted to thank you again for this wonderful and inspiring lecture. Thank you all for coming here for the discussion, and thanks to all the people at home for joining us and hoping to see you again at the KNIR. Thank you very much.